Welcome to the Secret Lives channel.
David Mitchell always thought his greatest asset was his relentless ambition, and his greatest liability was his quiet, unremarkable wife. For 5 years, he believed Clara was just a small-town girl who baked sourdough, wore cardigans from clearance racks, and possessed no understanding of the high-stakes corporate world he sought to conquer. He tolerated her mediocrity, convinced he was the star of their marriage while she was merely a stagehand. He was so busy craning his neck to look up at the penthouse suites of Chicago's elite, desperate to claw his way in, that he never bothered to look closely at the woman serving him dinner. If he had, he might have noticed that the modest costume jewelry she wore to the grocery store caught the light exactly like flawless, uninsured VVS diamonds. The house in Oak Park was, in David's eyes, a monument to his stalled potential. It was a charming, 3-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch, exactly the kind of house a middle manager at Harrison and Hayes Wealth Management was expected to buy. But David hated it. He hated the slight creak in the third stair. He hated the sensible beige siding. And most of all, he hated that it was the best he could do on his salary. Sitting across from him at the distressed wood dining table was Clara. She was knitting something shapeless and grey, the rhythmic click-clack of her needles the only sound in the room. Clara was undeniably beautiful, but in a muted, frustratingly unpolished way. She wore no makeup, her ash-blonde hair was tied up in a messy clip, and her sweater looked like it had survived a decade of brutal winters. She volunteered at the local animal shelter and taught a pottery class twice a week. She was, by all accounts, perfectly pleasant, and David was suffocated by her. "My mother called today," David said, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop. He was reviewing the third-quarter projections for the firm, nursing a glass of scotch. Clara didn't look up from her knitting. "Oh? How is Barbara doing?" "She's fine. She asked if you had finally decided to apply for that administrative job at the school district. To actually contribute." The knitting needles paused for a fraction of a second. "David, we've talked about this. I manage the household, and my volunteer work is important to me. Besides, we aren't hurting for money." David let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Not hurting for money? Clara, I drive a 4-year-old Honda. Do you know what the partners at Harrison and Hayes drive? Porsches, Mercedes, cars that don't smell like wet dog because you insisted on fostering another stray." He slammed his laptop shut. "You just don't get it. You have no drive, no hustle. You're perfectly content to just exist." Clara finally looked up. Her eyes, a striking, deep, oceanic blue, held a calmness that always unnerved David. It wasn't the look of a wounded wife. It was the look of someone observing a child throw a tantrum. "I'm content because I know what matters, David. Climbing a ladder just to look down on people doesn't appeal to me." "That's exactly the loser mentality my mother warns me about," David muttered, standing up and grabbing his coat. "I'm going back to the office. Some of us actually have to work for a living." As the front door slammed behind him, Clara set her knitting down. She walked over to the antique writing desk in the corner of the living room, a piece David thought she'd bought at a thrift store, entirely unaware it was an authentic 18th century Louis XVI piece worth more than their entire house. She unlocked a small drawer and pulled out a sleek, secure satellite phone. She dialed a number that wasn't saved in the contacts. It was answered on the first ring. "Miss Sterling?" a crisp British voice said. "Hello, Thomas," Clara replied, her voice losing its soft, Midwestern lilt, replaced by something sharper, more refined. "I need an update on the Harrison and Hayes portfolio. My father was considering an acquisition, wasn't he?" "Indeed, miss. Sterling DuPont Enterprises has been monitoring their liquidity crisis. They are desperate for a capital injection. Your father intends to acquire them for pennies on the dollar by the end of the fiscal year." Clara looked out the window at David's taillights disappearing down the street. "Tell my father to hold off," she said softly. "Let them sweat a little longer. And Thomas, I think it's almost time for me to come home." For 5 years, Clara Sterling had played the role of Clara Mitchell perfectly. Born into one of the most powerful, quietly wealthy families in the Western Hemisphere, Clara had grown up suffocated by bodyguards, boardrooms, and the crushing weight of legacy. When she met David at a coffee shop in Boston, she was incognito, finishing her master's degree under an assumed name. He was a junior analyst on a business trip. She was charmed by his ambition. He didn't know about the private jets or the chalets in Gstaad. She thought he loved her for her, but marriage had slowly stripped away David's charm, revealing a core of bitter entitlement. He didn't love Clara. He resented her for not being a stepping stone. "As you wish, Miss Sterling," Thomas replied. "Shall I prepare the Chicago penthouse?" "Yes," Clara said. "And Thomas? Make sure the guest list for the Sterling DuPont Gala next month includes Harrison and Hayes. It's time my husband met my family." The atmosphere at Harrison and Hayes was thick with desperation. The firm had made 3 disastrous bets on commercial real estate in the previous quarter, and the bleeding hadn't stopped. Gregory Harrison, the senior partner, had called an emergency meeting, his face flushed and sweating through his bespoke collar. David sat near the back of the glass-walled conference room, his leg bouncing nervously. Beside him sat Samantha Reed. If Clara was water, Samantha was fire. She wore razor-sharp Prada suits, her blonde hair was permanently blown out, and she oozed a kind of predatory corporate confidence that David found intensely intoxicating. She came from a moderately wealthy family in Connecticut and never let anyone forget it. "We need a white knight," Gregory was saying, pacing the front of the room, "and we have one shot. Sterling DuPont Enterprises is opening a new regional headquarters here in Chicago. They are looking for local wealth management firms to handle the pension funds for their Midwest subsidiaries. If we land even a fraction of their business, it saves the firm." A murmur went through the room. Sterling DuPont wasn't just a company, it was a global monolith. They owned shipping lines, tech conglomerates, and vast swaths of prime real estate. The family behind it was famously reclusive. The patriarch, Arthur Sterling, was a ghost in the media, and his only daughter had allegedly been living abroad for years. "I have 2 VIP tickets to the Sterling DuPont Charity Gala next Friday at the Waldorf Astoria," Gregory announced, holding up 2 embossed gold-leafed envelopes. "Tickets are $10,000 a plate, invitation only. I need my best sharks in the room. Samantha, you're coming. I need someone else who can talk aggressive growth." David felt his heart pound. This was it. The elevator to the top floor. He practically leapt out of his chair. "I can do it, Greg. I've been analyzing their recent acquisitions in the tech sector. I know their portfolio better than anyone." Gregory hesitated, then nodded. "Fine. Mitchell, you're with Samantha. Don't embarrass me." That evening, David practically floated into his house. He found Clara in the kitchen, carefully dicing vegetables for a stew. The house smelled like rosemary and garlic, but David barely noticed. "Clara, pack up whatever you're doing. I'm taking you out to celebrate. I just got tapped to help save the firm." He poured himself a glass of wine, not offering her one. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, a gentle smile on her face. "That's wonderful, David. What happened?" "Sterling DuPont Enterprises," David said, rolling the name around in his mouth like fine wine. "We're going to pitch them at their gala next week. If I land this, I make partner. Guaranteed." Clara's knife paused against the cutting board. "Sterling DuPont? I read a bit about them in the Tribune. Aren't they heavily over-leveraged in their European shipping division? If Harrison and Hayes is looking for a quick cash injection, pitching aggressive growth might backfire. They value long-term stability and discreet wealth preservation over flashy returns." David stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth. He stared at her, then let out a patronizing chuckle. "Clara, please. You read a newspaper article and suddenly you're a financial analyst. This isn't balancing the checkbook for the animal shelter. This is high-level macroeconomic strategy. Leave it to the professionals. Clara looked down at the vegetables. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glint. Of course. Silly of me. Besides, David continued, oblivious to the shift in the room's temperature, Samantha and I have the strategy locked down. She knows how these people operate. She's from their world. Samantha. Clara repeated the name evenly. Your colleague. Yes. We're going to the gala together next Friday. Clara turned to face him fully. Next Friday? David, next Friday is our 5th wedding anniversary. We had reservations at Bavette's. We booked it 2 months ago. David groaned, rubbing his temples. Clara, really? You're going to give me a hard time about a dinner when my entire career is on the line? This is the Sterling DuPont Gala. Billionaires are going to be in that room. I can't just tell Gregory Harrison I can't go because I have to eat a steak with my wife. Grow up. He didn't wait for her response, simply walking past her into the living room to text Samantha. Clara stood in the kitchen for a long time. She looked at the cheap, chipped plates in the cupboards. She looked at the worn rug by the sink. She had tried to give him a normal life. She had tried to be the supportive, grounding force he needed. But David didn't want a partner. He wanted an accessory. And he had just deemed her unworthy of being worn. She walked upstairs, ignoring David's laughter as he talked on the phone with Samantha. She went to her closet, pushed past the rows of Target cardigans and sensible slacks, and reached the back wall. She pressed her hand against a hidden panel, which clicked and slid open, revealing a biometric safe. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. Inside sat a velvet box. She opened it, the ambient light catching the breathtaking brilliance of the Sterling family heirloom, a necklace featuring a flawless 40-carat sapphire surrounded by a constellation of diamonds. Happy anniversary, David, Clara whispered to the empty room. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Waldorf Astoria was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Cascading crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a golden hue, reflecting off the polished marble floors and the ice sculptures guarding the caviar stations. The air hummed with the quiet, calculated murmurs of the Midwest's most powerful people, politicians, real estate moguls, and titans of industry. David Mitchell felt like an imposter, though he would never admit it. He stood near the bar, tugging nervously at the collar of his rented tuxedo. Beside him, Samantha was in her element, wearing a plunging crimson gown, laughing too loudly at a joke made by a junior executive from a logistics firm. "We need to find Arthur Sterling," David hissed to Samantha, grabbing a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. "Gregory said the man is here somewhere. If we can just get 2 minutes with him before the speeches." "Relax, David," Samantha purred, adjusting her diamond earrings. "Billionaires like Sterling don't talk business before the main course. We mingle, we make a good impression, and we wait for the opening. God, look at these people. The wealth in this room is disgusting. I love it." David scanned the crowd. It's hard to imagine anyone having this much power. Did you know Sterling's daughter is supposed to be here tonight? She's the sole heir. Whoever marries her basically owns the keys to the kingdom, Samantha laughed. "Don't get any ideas, married man. I'm sure she's some terrifying, polished ice queen who only dates European royalty. Speaking of your marriage, did your little wife throw a fit about you missing the big anniversary?" David waved a dismissive hand. "Clara?" "No, she sulked a bit. But she knows her place. She's at home, probably watching a baking show. She wouldn't last 5 minutes in a room like this anyway. The pressure would break her." As the clock struck 9, a gentle chime echoed through the sound system, silencing the ballroom. The heavy velvet curtains at the grand staircase parted, and an impeccably dressed man with silver hair and a commanding presence stepped up to the microphone. The room fell into a reverent hush. It was Arthur Sterling. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed, deep and resonant. "Thank you for joining us tonight to support the Sterling DuPont Global Literacy Initiative. Chicago has welcomed our new headquarters with open arms, and we are thrilled to become a part of this vibrant city's future." David nudged Samantha. "That's him. Get ready." "For decades," Arthur continued, a warm paternal smile touching his lips, "I have steered the ship of this family's enterprise. But the future does not belong to my generation. Tonight is a special occasion for my family. For the past 5 years, my daughter has been living a quiet, private life away from the media, learning the value of ground-level work and experiencing the world without the shield of the Sterling name. But tonight, she formally assumes her role as a vice-chairwoman of Sterling DuPont Enterprises." A ripple of excitement went through the crowd. The elusive heiress was finally stepping into the light. "Please," Arthur said, turning toward the top of the grand staircase, "welcome my daughter and the future of this company." A spotlight hit the landing at the top of the stairs. David craned his neck, eager to see the woman who wielded more financial power than the GDP of a small country. He expected a cold aristocrat, perhaps someone older, hardened by boarding schools and wealth management training. A woman stepped into the light. She was wearing a custom midnight blue Givenchy haute couture gown that moved like liquid velvet over her figure. Around her neck rested a sapphire and diamond necklace that practically blinded the front row. Her hair, usually tied up in a messy clip, was styled into an elegant, sweeping updo. Her makeup was flawless, accentuating striking, deep, oceanic blue eyes. The breath was violently punched from David's lungs. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sharp crack made a few heads turn, including Samantha's, who glared at him. "David, what the hell is wrong with you?" she hissed. David couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sweat instantly breaking out across his forehead. His vision tunneled, focusing entirely on the woman slowly descending the grand staircase. It was impossible. It had to be a hallucination brought on by stress. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea, she locked eyes with him. Across the massive ballroom, through the sea of billionaires and socialites, she found him. Clara Sterling, did not look away. She didn't look angry or hurt, or like the quiet, submissive wife he had left in Oak Park that morning. She looked at him the way a queen looks at a peasant who had just wandered into a court. She smiled, a terrifying, icy smile, and gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "David?" Samantha pulled at his sleeve, her voice dripping with annoyance. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Who is she?" David's mouth opened and closed. His brain scrambled to process the reality fracturing around him. The woman who volunteered at the animal shelter. The woman whose lack of hustle he had mocked just yesterday. The woman whose anniversary he had abandoned for a networking event to save his pathetic career. "That," David choked out, his voice barely a whisper, a sickening realization settling in the pit of his stomach. "That's my wife." Samantha Reed stared at David as if he had just suffered a massive stroke. Her impeccably lined lips parted in a sneer of utter disbelief. "Your wife? David, you drive a Honda Civic with a dent in the bumper. Your wife buys her sweaters at TJ Maxx. That woman is wearing a necklace worth more than our entire firm." "I know," David whispered, his voice cracking. He felt a cold sweat prickling his scalp. The room was spinning slightly, the golden light of the chandeliers blurring into blinding streaks. The eyes, the face. "It's Clara." Before Samantha could further dissect his apparent descent into madness, Gregory Harrison materialized beside them. The senior partner was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his usually ruddy face pale. "Mitchell, Reed, pull yourselves together," Gregory hissed, adjusting his cuffs. Arthur Sterling just stepped off the podium. "They are moving towards the VIP reception area by the ice sculptures. We have a 3-minute window before the European banking conglomerates swarm them. We go in, we congratulate the daughter, and we plant the seed for a formal pitch next week. Do not screw this up for me." Greg, wait, David stammered, his feet feeling like they were cast in concrete. I can't. I shouldn't be the one to— You begged for this, Mitchell, Gregory snapped, his voice a low, threatening growl. You told me you knew their portfolio. You are going to march over there, act like a shark, and justify your salary. Move! Propelled by a terrifying mixture of professional conditioning and sheer, morbid paralysis, David followed Gregory and Samantha through the sea of Chicago's elite. As they approached the reception area, the crowd naturally parted, maintaining a respectful perimeter around the Sterlings. Arthur Sterling was deep in conversation with a man David recognized as the CEO of a major multinational tech firm. Beside Arthur stood Clara. Up close, the transformation was even more devastating. She was holding a crystal coupe of sparkling water, nodding thoughtfully at a comment made by a senator's wife. She looked entirely in her element, exuding a quiet, gravitational power that made everyone around her lean in. Gregory cleared his throat, plastering on a salesman's smile that looked painfully artificial in this echelon of wealth. Mr. Sterling, Miss Sterling, forgive the intrusion. I am Gregory Harrison, Senior Partner at Harrison & Hayes Wealth Management. We are thrilled to welcome Sterling DuPont to Chicago. Arthur glanced at Gregory, his expression polite but entirely unreadable. Mr. Harrison, thank you. Clara turned her gaze slowly. Her deep, oceanic eyes swept over Gregory, briefly flicked to Samantha, taking in the plunging crimson gown with a micro-expression of mild amusement, and finally, inevitably, locked on to David. David stopped breathing. He waited for the gasp, the widening of her eyes, the sudden realization that her husband was standing in front of her, but Clara's expression remained perfectly, agonizingly composed. Mr. Harrison, Clara said, her voice smooth and melodic, carrying that same refined, aristocratic edge she had used on the phone earlier that day. I am familiar with Harrison and Hayes. Gregory beamed, looking back at David as if he had just struck gold. We are honored, Miss Sterling. My team has been closely following your expansion into the Midwest. In fact, my brightest associates here, Samantha Reed and David Mitchell, have prepared some preliminary thoughts on aggressive growth strategies for your pension fund allocations. Clara took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Aggressive growth, Clara repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour. How fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Mitchell. She addressed him directly, her eyes boring into his soul. Does aggressive growth include leveraging client assets to back mezzanine debt in the South Loop commercial real estate market? Because according to my analysts, Harrison and Hayes is currently facing a $90 million liquidity shortfall due to 3 catastrophic defaults in that exact sector. The color completely drained from Gregory's face. Samantha let out a tiny, involuntary gasp. David felt as though the floor had given way beneath him. It was a closely guarded, firm secret, known only to the partners and a few senior analysts. Well, the market has seen some unpredictable fluctuations, Gregory stammered, his polished facade shattering instantly. But our core portfolio remains robust. Your core portfolio, Clara interrupted softly, yet her voice cut through the noise of the ballroom like a scalpel, is bleeding, Mr. Harrison. You are desperately seeking a capital injection to stave off a credit downgrade by Monday morning. You didn't come here to manage our wealth. You came here hoping we would blindly rescue yours. Arthur Sterling watched his daughter with a look of quiet, paternal pride. He didn't say a word, letting her execute the surgical strike entirely on her own. David couldn't take it anymore. The humiliation, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of the moment bubbled over. "Clara!" he blurted out, stepping forward. "Clara, please. What are you doing? Why didn't you tell me?" Samantha grabbed David's arm, her fingernails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "David, shut up. Are you trying to get us sued?" Clara looked at David as if he were a mildly interesting specimen in a Petri dish. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her tone devoid of any familiarity or warmth. "I believe you mentioned to my father's associate earlier this week that you excel at macroeconomic strategy, rather than, what was it? Balancing the checkbook for the animal shelter?" David recoiled as if he had been physically struck. She had heard him. Of course she had heard him. He thought of all the times he had mocked her knitting, her volunteering, her lack of hustle, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively evaluating the financial ruin of his employer. "You must excuse us," Clara said smoothly, turning her attention back to Gregory, dismissing David entirely. "My father and I have matters to attend to that require a certain professional caliber. I suggest Harrison and Hayes focus on finding a bankruptcy attorney rather than a white knight." "Enjoy the caviar, Mr. Harrison. It is, after all, on us." With a subtle nod, she and Arthur turned away, immediately enveloped by a fresh wave of billionaires and politicians eager for their attention. Gregory stood frozen for a long second before turning to David. His eyes were wide with a manic, furious panic. "You told me you had this locked down, Mitchell," Gregory whispered venomously. "You are finished. Don't even bother coming into the office on Monday." As Gregory stormed off towards the bar, Samantha looked at David, shaking her head in disgust. "You really are an idiot, David," she spat, before turning on her heel and disappearing into the crowd. David stood alone in the center of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by wealth he could never comprehend, having just been fired, humiliated, and utterly destroyed by the quiet woman he had left dicing vegetables in Oak Park. The drive back to Oak Park was a blur of neon lights and panic. David pushed the Honda Civic to its limits, his mind frantically trying to piece together the shattered fragments of his reality. Clara was a billionaire. Clara was a sterling. Clara held the power to destroy his firm with a single conversation. He slammed the car into the driveway and sprinted up the porch steps, fumbling with his keys. "Clara!" he yelled, throwing the front door open. "Clara, we need to talk!" His voice echoed off the walls. The house was entirely dark. He flipped the light switch in the hallway and stopped dead in his tracks. The living room looked wrong. It took his panicked brain a moment to process why. The antique writing desk, the one he thought was thrifted junk, was gone. Her knitting basket was gone. The framed photos of her on the mantel were missing. He ran upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. He threw open the door to their bedroom and went straight to the closet. His side, lined with off-the-rack suits and sensible ties, remained untouched. Her side was completely empty. Not a single Target cardigan remained. He walked back downstairs, his breathing shallow and rapid. That was when he saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on the distressed wood dining table, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the blinds, was a thick, pristine manila envelope. He approached it slowly as if it were a bomb. The return address in the top left corner bore the name of Kirkland and Ellis, one of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate law firms in the world. He tore it open. Inside was a meticulously drafted petition for divorce. Attached to the front was a handwritten note on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, bearing the sterling DuPont crest. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably Clara's. "David, you spent 5 years looking at the ceiling, wondering how to get to the penthouse. You never realized you were already living with the landlord. I wanted a partner. You wanted a stepping stone. I hope you find the view from the bottom as enlightening as I found the view from the top. Do not attempt to contact me. My lawyers will handle the house." Clara. Monday morning brought a bloodbath to the financial district. David, despite Gregory's threat, showed up at the Harrison and Hayes building at 7 a.m., desperate to salvage something. Anything. He found the lobby swarming with nervous employees holding cardboard boxes. The news had broken at 6 a.m. in the Wall Street Journal. Sterling DuPont Enterprises had executed a hostile, highly leveraged buyout of Harrison and Hayes' outstanding debt. By 6:30 a.m., The Sterling family had effectively foreclosed on the firm. David rode the elevator up to the executive floor, his stomach in knots. The glass-walled conference room where, just days prior, Gregory had plotted their salvation was now occupied by a team of sharply dressed auditors and lawyers bearing the Sterling DuPont insignia on their briefcases. Gregory Harrison was sitting in his office, his head in his hands, 2 security guards standing uncomfortably outside his door. Samantha Reed was furiously packing her desk, screaming into a cell phone at a recruiter. "David," a calm, crisp British voice called out. David turned. Standing by the reception desk was a tall, immaculate man in a bespoke charcoal suit. It was the man from the phone. "Thomas. Mr. Mitchell. I am Thomas, Chief of Staff to Miss Sterling," he said, offering a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was told you might attempt to come in today." "I need to speak with my wife," David said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Where is she? At the new headquarters? The Aon Center?" "Miss Sterling is currently en route to Geneva for a board meeting," Thomas replied smoothly, checking a Patek Philippe watch. "And she is no longer your wife, Mr. Mitchell. The preliminary filings were submitted at 8 a.m. As for your presence here, it is no longer required." "She can't just do this," David shouted, the lingering remnants of his ego flaring up. "She bought my firm just to fire me? That's vindictive. I'm a senior analyst." Thomas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell, you flatter yourself. Miss Sterling did not acquire Harrison and Hayes to fire you. She acquired it because the real estate portfolio, once restructured, will yield a 14% return over the next decade. Firing you is merely a fringe benefit." Thomas gestured to the floor where the administrative assistants, the janitorial staff, and the junior researchers were huddled together, looking terrified. "In fact," Thomas continued, raising his voice slightly so the floor could hear, "Miss Sterling has authorized a comprehensive retention package for all support staff and junior-level employees. Full benefits, a 20% salary increase, and relocation to the new Sterling DuPont offices. The only individuals being terminated today are the executive partners." Thomas paused, locking eyes with David. "And you?" David looked at the assistants, the people he routinely ignored, the people he treated the way he had treated Clara. They were staring at him, not with pity, but with a quiet, undeniable satisfaction. "Your severance package is being mailed to you, Mr. Mitchell," Thomas said, handing David a small, sealed envelope. "Though I believe it only covers the standard 2 weeks. Miss Sterling specifically requested that you receive exactly what you earned." David took the envelope. It felt impossibly light. He looked around the office he had sacrificed his marriage for, the ladder he had kicked his wife down to climb. It was gone. All of it. "Good day, Mr. Mitchell," Thomas said, turning his back and walking into Gregory's office to deliver the final blow to the senior partner. David Mitchell walked to the elevator. He pressed the down button. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about how to get to the top floor. He was just wondering how he was going to afford the gas for his Honda Civic on the way home to an empty house. The descent from upper-middle-class comfort to absolute financial terror was not a sheer drop. It was a grueling, agonizing slide down a staircase covered in glass. For the first 3 weeks following the gala, David operated under a delusion of salvageability. He was, after all, a man who believed in his own resume. He printed out fresh copies on heavy, watermarked paper and began calling every connection he had made in the Chicago financial district. He reached out to recruiters at Morgan Stanley, leveraged old college buddies at J.P. Morgan Chase, and even swallowed his pride to cold call mid-tier wealth management firms in the suburbs. The responses were always the same: initial enthusiasm, followed by a sudden, inexplicable silence. Interviews were cancelled hours before they began. Emails bounced back. His calls went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until a rainy Tuesday, sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit lobby of a boutique firm on Wacker Drive, that the truth was spelled out for him. An old mentor, A man named Robert Hughes, who had guided David through his early 20s, agreed to a brief coffee. Robert looked exhausted, glancing nervously around the cafe, as if sitting with David were a crime. "David, you need to stop calling," Robert said quietly, not touching his espresso. "You're burning whatever microscopic bridges you have left." "Bob, I just need a foot in the door," David pleaded, his tailored suit hanging a little looser on his frame than it had a month ago. Harrison and Hayes went under, but my individual numbers were solid. You know I can produce. Robert sighed, a sound of profound pity. "It's not about your numbers, kid. It's about your name." The word came down from the Sterling DuPont transition team. They didn't issue a formal blacklist. That would be illegal. But they made it abundantly clear to every major player in the Midwest that any firm employing David Mitchell would find themselves permanently locked out of Sterling DuPont's corporate banking ecosystems, pension fund allocations, and philanthropic grants. Do you understand what that means? David stared at the dregs of his coffee. The reality was a physical weight on his chest. "They control billions in regional capital," Robert continued, his voice barely a whisper. "No one is going to risk $1 billion account to hire a senior analyst. You aren't just fired, David. You are exiled. You crossed a god. And now you don't get to pray in this church anymore." While David was drowning in the shallow end of the Chicago job market, Clara Sterling was navigating the freezing, shark-infested waters of high finance in Geneva, Switzerland. The global headquarters of Sterling DuPont Enterprises sat on the edge of Lake Geneva, a monolithic structure of glass and steel that housed secrets capable of toppling sovereign economies. Clara sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany boardroom table. The room was populated by 24 of the most ruthless executives in Europe. Opposite her sat Theodore Blackwood, the chief operating officer of the European division. Theodore was a relic of the old guard, an Oxford-educated aristocrat who viewed Arthur Sterling's decision to appoint his daughter as vice-chairwoman as an offensive joke. For weeks, Theodore had been subtly undermining her authority, withholding quarterly reports, and organizing backdoor meetings with shareholders at UBS and Zürcher Cantonal Bank to cast doubt on her competence. He thought Clara was soft. He thought the 5 years she spent pretending to be a suburban housewife had dulled whatever corporate instincts she possessed. He was fatally wrong. "The acquisition of the Baltic shipping lines is simply too aggressive for this quarter, Clara," Theodore said, using her first name in a deliberate show of disrespect. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Your father built this company on calculated, measured growth, plunging billions into a volatile logistics sector based on a hunch well, it's amateurish. The board will not support it." A murmur of agreement rippled through Theodore's loyalists at the table. Clara did not flinch. She wore a tailored, charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon. She looked at Theodore with the same deep, oceanic calmness that used to infuriate David when she was knitting in Oak Park. "Is that your formal assessment, Theodore?" Clara asked, her voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. "It is," Theodore replied smoothly. "We must protect the shareholders from unnecessary emotional investments." Clara opened a slim leather folder on the desk in front of her. She extracted a single sheet of paper and slid it across the polished wood. It came to a stop exactly in front of Theodore. "This is a transcript of a wire transfer," Clara said, the temperature in the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees. "Specifically, a transfer of 4.2 million euros from a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands to a private account at Bank Pictet. The Shell Corporation is a direct subsidiary of the very Baltic shipping line you are so desperately trying to prevent us from acquiring." Theodore's aristocratic sneer vanished. His face went entirely grey. "You see," Clara continued, standing up and slowly pacing the length of the table, I spent 5 years living with a man who believed that if he spoke loudly enough, no one would notice he was stealing credit, cutting corners, and covering up his own gross incompetence. I learned how to spot a fraud from a mile away. You oppose the acquisition, Theodore, because the moment Sterling DuPont auditors look at the Baltic Line's ledger, they will find the kickbacks you've been receiving for funneling our logistics contracts their way. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. No one dared to breathe. My father built this company on calculated growth, yes, Clara said, stopping behind Theodore's chair. She leaned in, her voice a lethal whisper that the entire room could hear. But he entrusted its future to me because I am willing to cut out the rot. You are officially terminated, Theodore. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the premises. Your severance will be tied up in litigation by our friends at Kirkland and Ellis for the next decade. If you attempt to contact the board, I will hand these transcripts to Interpol. Theodore stood up, his hands shaking, his career and reputation vaporized in less than 3 minutes. He opened his mouth to speak, found no words, and walked out of the heavy oak doors, looking like a dead man. Clara returned to the head of the table and sat down. She looked at the remaining 23 executives. The skepticism in their eyes had been entirely replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. Now, Clara said smoothly, closing the leather folder, let us discuss the Baltic acquisition. I trust there are no further objections. There were none. 18 months had passed since the night the earth opened up and swallowed David Mitchell's ambition whole. The brutal Chicago winters had twice given way to the stifling, humid summers, and the high-stakes financial district had moved on, entirely oblivious to the microscopic tragedies of its former residents. In the fast-paced world of wealth management, a fallen analyst was forgotten before his desk was even cleared. David now sat behind a laminated faux wood desk at a retail branch of a mid-tier regional bank in the deep suburbs of Naperville. He was no longer a macroeconomic strategist projecting 8-figure yields. He was a retail loan officer, level 2. His daily existence consisted of approving predatory auto loans for college students buying used sedans, and carefully explaining to exhausted parents why their debt consolidation applications had been denied. The physical toll of his descent was evident. The tailored Italian suits that once armored him had been sold on consignment months ago to cover his mounting, utterly futile legal fees during the divorce. He now wore off-the-rack polyester blend slacks that trapped the heat and pale blue dress shirts that frayed slightly at the cuffs. His hairline had retreated, and the confident, hungry spark in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, permanent exhaustion. He was broke, thoroughly humbled, and trapped in a beige purgatory of his own making. He had spent the first year consumed by a toxic, burning resentment. He had pictured Clara in her Swiss penthouse, actively monitoring his misery, laughing with her father as they systematically ruined his life out of pure, vindictive spite. It was the only way his ego could survive the fall, by believing he was, at the very least, an important enough enemy to warrant a billionaire's wrath. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of soul-crushing doldrum where the loudest sound in the room was the hum of the fluorescent overhead lights. David was mindlessly clicking through a credit approval screen for a local plumbing contractor, rubbing his temples to stave off a lingering headache. The bell above the bank's double-glass doors chimed. David didn't look up immediately. "Welcome to National Suburban. I'll be right with you," he recited mechanically, his eyes scanning a discrepancy in the plumber's W-2 forms. He heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps before he saw them. It wasn't the usual shuffle of suburbanites seeking cashier's checks. It was the sharp, deliberate cadence of authority. David looked up, his hand freezing on his computer mouse. 2 men in dark, perfectly tailored suits with discreet earpieces stood flanking the entrance, their eyes scanning the small lobby with professional detachment. The branch manager, a nervous, balding man named Todd, froze halfway through restocking the complimentary coffee station a handful of sugar packets slipping from his fingers to the linoleum floor. Then a third man stepped between the guards and approached David's desk. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than David's annual salary, and possessed a posture so rigidly perfect it commanded immediate silence. It was Thomas. David's heart seized, a cold spike of adrenaline piercing his chest. The ghost of his past life had just walked into his depressing present. He felt the eyes of the bank tellers and the few customers in the lobby lock onto him. "Mr. Mitchell," Thomas said, his British accent as crisp, refined and unforgiving as a freshly minted razor blade. "I trust I am not interrupting your vital work." David stood up slowly, the cheap wheels of his office chair squeaking loudly against the plastic floor mat. "Thomas," he breathed, his voice tight with a mixture of old anger and new panic. "What do you want? I don't have anything left for her to take. You and Kirkland and Ellis made absolutely sure of that." Thomas did not smile. His expression remained one of polite, absolute indifference. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and slowly withdrew a thick, sealed envelope. It was made of heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper that felt more like fabric, and bore the sterling DuPont crest embossed in gold foil in the top left corner. He placed it gently onto the center of David's laminated desk, right over the plumbing contractor's credit report. "Miss Sterling is currently in Chicago for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the new philanthropic wing at the Field Museum," Thomas said, his tone conversational but entirely devoid of warmth. "She requested that I deliver this to you personally before our flight back to Geneva this evening. It requires no response." David stared at the envelope as if it were a live explosive. He expected a gag order, a lawsuit regarding a breached non-disclosure agreement he had forgotten about, or perhaps a bill for some obscure legal fee meant to bankrupt him entirely. "What is it?" he asked, his hands remaining firmly at his sides. "A conclusion," Thomas replied softly. He gave David a curt, formal nod, a gesture of pure, old-world manners, completely disconnected from respect, turned on his heel, and walked out of the bank. The two security guards fell in seamlessly behind him, and within seconds, the tinted windows of a black Maybach gliding out of the parking lot signaled their departure. Todd, the branch manager, scurried over, his eyes wide. "David? Who on earth was that?" "Nobody, Todd," David whispered. "Just give me a minute." David sat back down heavily. He waited until his hand stopped shaking, before he reached out and broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. There was no aggressive corporate letterhead, no threats of litigation. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the deed to the 3-bedroom, beige-sided colonial house in Oak Park. Attached to the deed was a notarized certificate of satisfaction. The mortgage, nearly $400,000 remaining, had been settled in full. The property was legally his, free and clear, with the taxes prepaid for the next 10 years. Clipped to the very front was a small piece of heavy stationery. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and unmistakably Clara's. "David, the mortgage has been settled. The property is legally yours. You always hated this house because you thought it was a monument to your stalled potential. I loved it because I thought it was a home, and for a short time, I was happy there. Consider this our final settlement. I know you have spent the last year believing I am a villain actively plotting your ruin. The truth is much simpler and perhaps harder to hear. I haven't thought of you at all. I did what was necessary to protect my family's assets, and then I went back to work. Don't spend the rest of your life looking up at penthouses that will never let you in. Just look at what's right in front of you. Build something real." See. David sat motionless in his cheap office chair. The stale air of the bank rushed out of his lungs in a ragged exhale. The delusion he had clung to for 18 months shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Clara wasn't a monster who had maliciously destroyed his life out of a broken heart. She wasn't holding a grudge. She just didn't care. The firing, the industry blacklisting, the brutal one-sided divorce. It wasn't an epic tale of revenge. It was routine pest control. He had been a mosquito buzzing in the ear of a titan, and she had simply swatted him away so she could focus on her empire. Handing him the deed to a $600,000 house wasn't an act of lingering love, and it certainly wasn't an apology. It was an act of profound, devastating pity. It was Clara acknowledging that he was fundamentally incapable of surviving in the ruthless world he so desperately wanted to conquer. To her, this house was a rounding error on a Tuesday morning. She was giving him a safe, comfortable beige box to live the rest of his mediocre life in, ensuring he wouldn't freeze on the streets, the same way she used to bring home stray dogs from the animal shelter. He was her final rescue project. David looked up from the letter. Across the room, a young couple was waiting nervously on a vinyl sofa, hoping he would approve a modest loan for a kitchen remodel so they could start a family. He looked down at his frayed polyester cuffs. He thought of Samantha Reed, who he had heard was now selling mid-tier timeshares in Orlando after being similarly exiled by the Sterling DuPont transition team. He picked up his cheap plastic ballpoint pen. He signed his name at the bottom of the plumbing contractor's approval form, stamping it with a loud thwack. He carefully folded the deed to the Oak Park house, slid it into his scuffed leather briefcase, and snapped it shut. For the first time in 5 years, David Mitchell didn't feel the burning need to climb. He didn't feel angry. He just felt an overwhelming, hollow quiet. Clara Sterling had taken off her disguise and inherited the earth, leaving David exactly where he always belonged, grounded in reality, finally forced to look at the unremarkable life he had never bothered to truly appreciate. David's story serves as a stark, modern parable about the dangers of unchecked ego and the fatal flaw of underestimating those who walk quietly beside us. True power rarely needs to announce itself with flashy cars, loud demands, or desperate networking. It often resides in the silent observation, the steady patience, and the profound competence of those we mistakenly overlook. David destroyed his own life, not because he lacked ambition, but because his ambition was entirely devoid of empathy and respect for his partner. He chased the illusion of status while entirely blind to the immense, grounded reality standing in his own kitchen. Ultimately, Clara's triumph was not in her wealth, but in her unyielding self-respect, proving that the most formidable people are those who know their own worth, long before the world is forced to recognize it.